well, welcome. We're super excited to have you here for the
Thank
Faculty
you.
Spotlight. This is the second of all the interviews, so this is very exciting. I thought I'd just give like a little bit of a background about how it got started. So
Okay.
earlier this semester, we had people come to the Crescent and say like, we really would love to see more faculty research in the Crescent because we have all these talented faculty members and they're publishing and they're doing all these things, and the students don't necessarily know about it. Like, oh, that's true. Like we should get them involved. And so that's kind of where it came out. Tommy just came out to one of the meetings and said, does anyone want to take this on? And I said, yes, that sounds super exciting.
Yeah.
And so we've just been reaching out to people and taking names and doing interviews. And so we're super, super excited that this is going to keep going. So would you like to just introduce yourself just for background and talk a little bit about who you are, what you teach, things like that?
Yeah, so I'm James MacLeod. I'm professor of history, and I'm chair of a department called History, Politics, and Social Change. So these are pretty connected things, but also different disciplines in some ways. So it's a pretty interesting department. We've got, I think, probably 50 to 60 majors and minors, and a really good group of young people. So I teach mostly European history from about the Renaissance through the present day. And probably if I focus on anything more than anything else, it's on World War I and World War II. Although my current research, as we'll talk about, is actually on Evansville, Indiana.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's good. Like I said, I'm an archaeology and classics double major, so I'm adjacent, related.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is very exciting to hear about. And I have friends who are in the history department, so it's exciting to hear a little bit about the things that go on over there, since it is like kind of like a sister department, I would say. So we have a lot of things, very exciting things to talk about. I know that you were super excited when you reached out to me about how you have these 3 different phases in your research, and you do cartoons and all these things, so it's going to be, I think, a really good conversation. And so to kind of just dive into that, the first thing that you had mentioned was you started looking into like Christianity, how it became like impacted in the 19th century, different like political things that were going on, different movements that were happening. So I guess just to start, like, how did you become interested in that? How did that happen? And like, what do you look at?
Yeah, so just I finished up my undergraduate degree in 1988, and I wasn't really quite sure what to do with my life. And I didn't really think about going into continuing in academics, going into grad school. 2 of my siblings had gone to grad school and didn't finish PhDs. I was working actually a summer job, and I literally bumped into a professor who I'd only had as a freshman, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him, what I was literally doing at that moment, and he was like, "No, I mean, what are you doing with your life?" I said, "Oh, I'm not exactly sure." And he said, "You should be in a PhD program here." And he basically just literally bumping into this professor, Richard McKenney, in a park in Edinburgh, got me on the road, and very soon after that I was enrolled in a PhD program. So that was kind of how the PhD side of it started. And then the reason I chose to research 19th century Scotland was my dad was a minister in a Presbyterian church in Scotland that had been formed as the result of a split, of a schism that took place in another church in the early 1890s. So it was exactly 100 years. The events that I was looking at were exactly 100 years before
when you were looking at it.
So my kind of crass commercial motivation was, I thought maybe if I finished in time for the centennial of this event, I could get it published as a book. So that was kind of how I thought about it, and I thought it would be really cool and interesting to study the origins of the church that I'd grown up in and was a really central part of our lives, and really our whole cultural life was centered on this church. So it was a pretty interesting process to be doing research about something that was so close to home.
Yeah, of course. And were you able to finish like before this centennial? Like what happened with all that or not?
Yeah, well, what made it complicated was that this was a really, really conservative Protestant church.
I see.
And they believed very much in the literal truth of the Bible and all of that. and they believed very fervently that the events that led to the church being formed was basically God's will.
Okay.
And so this happened because God said it was going to happen. And as a historian, you can't exactly say that. So, I was looking at social and cultural and political and regional and racial issues that led to it. And really nobody in the church kind of approved of taking this secular approach to the history of the church. So they had no interest in publishing it. But, and I did get it finished more or less in time. 1893 was the centennial, and I did finish my PhD in 93. But it was a kind of long and winding road. It did get published eventually, but it took a few years after that. So that eventually became my first book.
Yeah, I think that's like startlingly relevant, that idea of like when you're looking into these issues that are like religion, that are so important to people and people take so seriously and for good reason. And then as a historian coming into that, like we run into that with archaeology as well, like looking at these like ancient religions, and it's like, what's a way that we can do this that's both like using modern historical practice, but also like respectful of the beliefs of these people that we can't fully understand and they're not like alive today and things like that.
Yeah, oh, definitely. So, I mean, I think it's an aspect of being a historian or archaeologist or anthropologist that maybe doesn't get talked about enough, is just how delicate the process is sometimes. And we should probably always be super delicate when we're dealing with other people's lives, but when they're all dead and gone, and in some cases been dead and gone for thousands of years, I think it's sometimes hard to retain your sense of delicacy for these people. In my case, my parents were just really one generation after this event took place. Their parents were involved in it, and obviously the church was a huge part of my life. So it was, I mean, I keep saying the word delicate, but it really was. I was kind of tiptoeing around.
Yeah, I'm
and
sure.
Knowing that your work was going to be judged by academic peers, but at the same time, at some point, you were going to have to, give a copy to my dad.
Right. What was he going to say? Yeah.
I think I definitely lent more towards the academic, scholarly side of things. Academics were pretty pleased with what I produced, and the people in the church not so much.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's hard to please everyone.
For sure.
In that sense, for sure. And so also with these topics, one of the things that I had noticed and like emailed to you when you first were telling me about these things, it's like the idea of like this division caused by like the historical research, but then also just division, like you talked about, like the social, the political, the racial changes that were going on in your area. What, if any, do you see like parallels with looking at like your historical church, like where you grew up and like maybe like living in modern America today? Yeah,
I think that's a really terrific question. I think I would maybe say two things in answer to that. One is the issues that I was looking at in the late 19th century were very much a product of a time in Scotland. Scotland was one of the really key centres of the Industrial Revolution, as you know, and so industrialization, urbanization, the rise of science, I suppose, broadly speaking, post-1859, the wider discussion of the theory of evolution, the rise of a more critical perspective on the Bible and the text of the Bible, for example. So these were all things that were going on, and religious people had to make decisions about how they were going to react to that. And very broadly speaking, you could either compromise with modernity and say we can tweak our beliefs to fit this new knowledge, or you could say we're going to turn our back on the new knowledge and hold hard to what we've always believed. And so the people that I was looking at were a really kind of extreme example of the latter. These were folks who absolutely flatly rejected all the findings of modern science and evolution and textual criticism and all of that. And they said, every word of the Bible is true from the first word in Genesis, the last book in Revelation. So, I look at, I think religious people today, whatever your faith is, mean, you're confronted with a rapidly changing world. I think there's a lot of challenges to religion. If you look at census data across the Western world especially, religious belief seems to be in pretty steep decline, certainly in Western Europe. Really steep decline, especially among young people. I think it's impossible for religious communities to be separate from the world as a world at large. And so I think that makes it super challenging for them. So I think religious communities today have to make that same decision. You know, where on this continuum am I going to fall? Am I going to adjust to the new world? Am I going to stick completely to the old world, or is it going to be somewhere in between? So I find that interesting. And then the second thing I would say is just more briefly would be that it's really clear how big a component of identity religion is, right? And I'm sure your studies in classics and archaeology and looking at anthropology as well, you know, I think that's probably always been the case and pretty much everywhere you go. And so when you're critiquing someone's religion or arguing with someone about religion, not only do they care deeply about it, but it's very much tied to who they think they are, which I think makes it a very complicated and fascinating topic.
Absolutely. And I think that only makes it more important, honestly, because if you're trying to get to know people like on a deep level and they are a person of faith, whatever that faith is, I think like being able to talk about that is really important. And I know that like one of the stereotypes of coming to college is like, oh, you'll meet people who have like different beliefs than you, and like, but I think that's true and it's important and it's like it's valuable. As someone who grew up in a very rural, like Protestant and Catholic kind of surrounding area, I'm from Minnesota. It's very rural where I'm from. Coming to Evansville and like being surrounded with people who are from different religions, or like I didn't even realize that how many like Southern Baptists there were, because there aren't any in Minnesota. So it's like meeting people of these different backgrounds, I think is important, and like to try to get to know them well, you do have to be able to talk about these things. So I think that's important.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I think the ability to listen to other people, genuinely listen to other people, even if you disagree with them or if what they're saying doesn't make much sense to you from your worldview, I think that's a really critical part of it. And I think, you know, this is so enjoyable because it's a conversation rather than someone just kind of releasing talking points. I think it's always really easy to talk about what you believe. And I think it's harder to really carefully listen to other people. So yeah, I think if young people can learn that between 18 and 22, you know, I think it's a positive outcome for the world as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think like the ability to listen obviously applies to so many things besides religion, and so I think like, yeah, that is definitely a good takeaway for people to just realize like this is important.
Battery might have died.
Are you dead, camera? It might be.
Let me have a look.
We should look at it. It might be dead.
Yeah, it looks like it's dead.
This one is going. This one is, I think this one's the important one, because this one's the one's on you, but I think we're probably good, but that's fun.
Put a little photo of you up on the screen every time.
Yeah, in the other recording, it kind of switches back and forth. But again, I don't know how important that is for people, because I don't know that people are going to be really watching it as opposed to listening to it anymore. Right.
I had a friend, a dear friend at Harlexton, her name was Helen Snow, and her husband Peter Snow worked for the BBC, and he used to talk about a really important part of any interview was filming what they called the noddies, which is where the interviewer is nodding. Oftentimes it's just the back of their head, like nodding. So
there are a couple of clips from the first interview where it's like focused on Dr. Miller, and like the cameras were set up a bit different, and so this camera was like shooting past the side of my head. So like the side of my head is like in it. It's like you don't need that. Like it's okay.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anything that you want to add on that first phase of your research?
The only thing I would say, just in relation to what you just raised there, was that the environment where I was for graduate school which was basically the theology school of the University of Edinburgh. We were working in church history. The study room, basically the graduate students' room that I worked in, was just an incredible collection of people from all over the world. And they were, because Edinburgh is a centre of Christianity, it didn't have diversity in terms of world religions. There were a few different world religions, but most people were Christians of one kind or another. But it was a really wide range, and people from all over Asia, all over Africa, North and South America, and all over Europe. So, you can imagine a bunch, and I was probably the youngest. I'd gone more or less straight from undergrad, so I was in my early 20s, and there were people there in their 50s and 60s for whom coming back to college was this awesome opportunity. So there were, and people married with children and all of that stuff, so it was just this really wonderful environment where we sat around and talked a lot. We did listen to each other. We liked each other. There was lots of arguments, but also just lots of really deep conversations about people's perspectives on the world. And it was cool isn't a great sophisticated word to use, but it was cool. Really cool. Yeah. And I stayed in touch with a lot of these people, and it was a really great start to my academic life.
No, that's awesome. I have a friend here at school who's Southern Baptist, and I'm Roman Catholic, and we'll sit down and have, just like 3 hour, like the best conversations you can imagine about life and just everything. And so I can only imagine all the things that you guys were able to bring up and talk about in those kind of circles.
Yeah,
so
it was great.
Very good. So then it looked like the second phase of your research also did talk about religion, but a little bit later. So you mentioned how you were looking at World War I and how that impacted religion. So how did, we can talk about what did you research, but then also how did that change come about, where your interest shifted? Yeah,
well, part of it was practical, that I got my first job out of grad school at Harlexton.
Okay.
So I was in England working really hard on new classes and all that sort of stuff. So at that point, I was really kind of recycling material that I'd done for my PhD and trying to get that published in journals and that kind of thing. But by 1999, we'd moved to Evansville. So I had all my books and everything with me, but it just was at that point, it was a little bit, the internet of course existed, but internet research wasn't really a thing. So it was, excuse me, I'll just start that sentence again. Internet research wasn't really a thing, so it just became increasingly impractical to try to research 19th century obscure Presbyterianism.
While you were here?
While I was here.
See, okay.
And then coupled with that, I'd always been super passionate about the First World War, just really, really interested in that from childhood. My grandfather, my mum's father, was a medic in the First World War in the British Army. He was in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he lived to be 97 years old, and he really never told any stories about the First World War. So you've heard that a million times. People come back from war and they don't talk about it, and he certainly didn't. But I was really intrigued by the First World War, read a lot about it when I was a kid, and I was always really amazed by war memorials. So I realized if I was a religious historian who was interested in the First World War, I could maybe transition to looking at religion in the First World War. So I did there was a period where I was doing research on really how the First World War affected Orthodox Christian beliefs. And specifically I was really interested in the idea that developed during the First World War that if you were killed in the war, that meant that you were automatically going to heaven. And so this kind of rhetoric of a holy war, and rhetoric that indicated very clearly that salvation, being saved from your sins and all of that, was now available through serving your country in the war. And that was really pretty widely accepted and widely preached, really all over Britain. And I looked specifically at Scotland, and it happened there for sure. And that then brought me back to looking at the published writings of the people in the church that I grew up in. So again, super conservative, kind of stick in the mud. We're not adjusting for anything, and they very much rejected this change, and they preached this very difficult message that we believe that you're only going to go to heaven if you've had a conversion experience and you've been saved already, and the fact that you die in battle doesn't change that. If you were saved already, you'll go to heaven. If you weren't, you'll go to hell. And you can absolutely imagine that first doctrinal change that I talked about was pretty much designed as a comfort for a congregation, right?
Yeah,
if people are sitting in a congregation with their sons out on the Western Front or Eastern Front or at sea, it's pretty comforting to think if they die, they're going to go to heaven. And so you can imagine what a difficult message it must have been to both to convey and to hear, for these Scottish Presbyterian ministers to say, no, the old rules still apply. So I found that really interesting. I also found out that some of the church is called the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Some of these men signed up to be chaplains for the British Army. Some of them went to France and served as chaplains and all that kind of thing. So it was kind of interesting, just a little microcosm of how one small, mostly in the Highlands of Scotland, how that culture and that religious culture reacted to the war. And then I moved on from that to focusing on war memorials.
Okay.
And specifically, I looked at, again, I was trying to tie together religion and war. And so my research focused on what are the religious messages of World War I memorials. So that was kind of, I would say, the maybe like 2005 to 2015 or round about there. So even in that short time, internet research was now much more doable. And I realized that there were these fantastic and developing databases that gave lots and lots of information about thousands of war memorials in Scotland. And so I basically I had a sabbatical in 2012, and I sat down and I was determined I wanted to research at least 1,000 Scottish memorials.
Oh, wow.
And try to get data from them. So I ended up with 1,177 was the number. I got to that number and just collapsed off my chair.
I'm sure. Can't imagine why.
I couldn't look at another memorial. And what it was a little bit, it's not the most sophisticated analysis in the world, but I basically had a spreadsheet where I was saying, is the memorial in a church? Is it located right next to a church? Does it have a cross on it? If not, what do the words on the memorial say? Do they mention God? Like vast number of memorials will say to the glory of God, and then they'll say something else. Is there a quote from the Bible? Is there a religious statement on there? Is there some other religious symbolism? Virgin Mary or somebody from King David or whatever. So
And you found that there was in most of the cases.
I don't have all the numbers at the tip of my
Yeah.
fingers, but if you just applied that very kind of broad definition of religious, about 80%,
Oh, wow.
90% had religious symbolism contained on them. But I then thought, well, some of that stuff you could say isn't really that religious. A cross could be a religious symbol, but it could be a Celtic cross, for example, which is it's a pre-Christian symbol in the Celtic world. Maybe that's not a Christian cross. Maybe it's something else. And even something like "to the glory of God," are they really thinking this memorial is to the glory of God,
Mm-hmm.
or was that just a kind of habitual,
Like what was said.
yeah, just a
Yeah.
saying bless you when someone sneezes kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing? So I then went through the the 1177 memorials again and looked for things that were kind of unusually religious, if that
I
makes
mean,
sense.
yeah.
So um, quotes from the Bible that were really unusual that people would have had to think real hard about before putting on a
Mm-hmm.
memorial, that kind of thing. And when I applied that filter, only about 13%
Oh, wow.
fit that. So, so I kind of concluded that research by saying, either War memorials were super religious or they weren't. And
Wow.
so it's hard to be objective, but if you're admittedly being subjective looking at it, you could make one of two arguments. You could say these memorials reflect the fact that Scotland was still a pretty religious country despite everything that happened in the 19th century and despite the huge challenge that World War II, excuse me, that despite the huge challenge that World War One provided to
Mm-hmm.
face. Um, and people were very much still centered on the parish system, and many memorials talk about the men who belonged to this parish who
Mm-hmm.
died in the war. So you could say, despite everything, Scotland was still pretty religious, and the war memorials prove it. Or if you look at my kind of second filter, you could say Scotland was superficially religious
Mm.
still by the 1920s, but all of the challenges of the 19th century plus World War One had begun to mount up, and most of these religions are just a kind of bless you when you sneeze type
Mm-hmm.
of religion. They're not very like deeply or seriously religious, which is a reflection of a society that's becoming more secular.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like it depends a little bit on what perspective you have going in.
Yeah.
So, if you were going to come to a conclusion about Scotland in the 20s, Grace, you'd of course need 10 other
Right.
areas of study to look at. But I just thought this was a one little interesting
Yeah.
set of data points that can be used for the conversation.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's interesting too, just to talk about the idea of how one set of data points can be interpreted in such different ways, because that's like a realistic part of research is that it's not usually like cut and dry that the answer appears from the heavens and it's
Yeah.
all, it's that idea that you can interpret it multiple ways and that how you go into it, what you're thinking you're going to find is going to affect that, I think is valuable.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I mean, I think I'm always trying to communicate to students that two people could look at the same source
Mm-hmm.
and come to completely different conclusions, and we have to be so alert to the fact that we're bringing our own preconceptions and biases to the table all the time. Um, so it's kind of interesting because I'm actually going to do a talk about this when I go back to Scotland in December. And I haven't really looked at this research in more than 10 years, so it's kind of interesting to do that as well, to put research aside for a
Mm-hmm.
decade and then come back to it. And, sometimes that can be pretty disappointing. You come back to it and go, man, that's garbage.
Oh
But
no.
with this one, I thought, it's definitely got its flaws, and I'll be interested to hear what people think. But
Mm-hmm.
um, it, I think it's an interesting part of the story.
Yeah. No, that is cool. It is, and that is an interesting perspective. Like, um, what effect does time have on how you view things
Mhm,
too? So,
mhm.
absolutely. Anything you'd like to add about that phase of the research before you go to the third one?
No, I don't think so. I think your questions are awesome.
Okay, thanks. So the final one that we had talked about, and you have already hinted at it after you moved to Evansville, was like looking into the local Evansville history, especially as it relates to World War II. So that kind of makes sense. I can see like you come here, it's where you live. Obviously Evansville does have this presence in like the manufacturing in World
Mhm.
War II. So if you could just talk about how you got interested in that and then what you looked at for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a really it's a kind of important lesson for any academic and any historian for sure. I kind of looked down my nose a little bit at local
Mm,
history. I thought people that kind of puttered around their looking at church records in their home village, or looking at the history of the person that lived in that house there.
Mhm.
To me, these things seemed really small,
Mhm.
and relatively unimportant compared to things like, the theory of evolution or World War One.
Right.
Um, and then gradually over time, as I got here and I started thinking about it a little bit, I came to the conclusion that really the opposite was maybe more true, which is that local history is the foundation on which everything else is built, and that it's incredibly important to know about your own roots and to know about where you come from and where you live. So I was just really fortunate, I think, that the opportunity arose to do some research, and in fact, I was invited to write a book about Evansville in World War II. Um, and I thought, uh, I was definitely interested in it. And there's, like you said, there's a ton of really important and interesting things to research. But I was very hesitant to jump into the water of local history, given that there's already a whole bunch of people who are in the local history community here. And I was a kind of double alien. I was not from Evansville, and I wasn't even from the United States. And so, what I think is just really beautiful about this part of the world is that as soon as I indicated an interest in local history here, the local history community just embraced me,
That is awesome.
and people, very much open arms and open homes and all of that. And they were incredibly welcoming. Instead of saying, "Who the heck do you think you are?" They very much were saying, "You're interested in Evansville as well? That's awesome. Come on in."
Mhm.
And so that was really cool. And so my research for the book, which was published in 2015, that research was very much kind of paper printed source based. Spent a ton of time reading Evansville newspapers, looking at documents of various kinds, photographs, all of that stuff. Didn't really talk to people. There was no oral history component. I mean, talked to a couple of old people and told little bits of their stories, but it was very much a pretty traditional history book with, a huge bibliography of printed sources. And I think it's fine. If I were to do it again now, I think I could do a much better job than I did then, but it's okay. But almost immediately people started asking, did you talk to anybody? Did you
Oh
have
no.
any interesting stories? And I was kind of like, no. Um, and again, just my great good fortune is that right at the same time, WNIN, the local public television station, wanted to have someone make a documentary about Evansville in World War II. And I worked with Joe Atkinson, who was kind of Tommy Houseman's predecessor. He's a slightly smaller but just as bald Tommy. And so Joe worked and he taught communications here, and he'd made documentary films before. And he read my book, and we agreed to team up. So, um, I know you'd asked me ahead of time, how different is it? How do you end up making a documentary as
Mhm.
opposed to writing stuff? Um, and I was really entirely in the hands of Joe, who kind of knew how to do it. And my biggest question was, this was 2015. Um, how many of these people are still around? And we really didn't know. So Joe and me went on a local TV station, went on Channel 14. Brad Bird interviewed us, and we said, "This is what we're planning to do. And if you know anyone that was alive during the war, please let us know." And we gave out our cell phone numbers, and didn't have really high hopes that there would be that large number of people. And almost immediately, our phone started ringing,
Oh wow.
and people were getting in touch with us. My dad's still alive, my grandpa's still alive, my neighbor remembers. My auntie Betty worked in the shipyard, all of that stuff.
Wow.
So, um, the combination of that and a few local experts, we ended up interviewing about 40 people for this documentary, and it was really awesome. It was a fantastic experience. We would just arrange to meet them. We'd go into their home, set up the cameras and mics and all of that. Um, Joe would set up the cameras, and I was tasked with getting these little lapel
The
mics
lapel mics, yeah.
to these little old ladies' shirts, which was, very delicate. Like, why is this my job? But it was really great. And so we had people who were children during the war and had memories of what their mom and dad were doing and that kind of thing. Um, all the way through to, I think the oldest person we talked to was 99 years old, and he was a laborer in town. He was actually a black man from Alabama, and he talked about some of the racism he encountered in Evansville. So it was really, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. We got a really good, I think, portrait of what Evansville was like at the time. We talked about lots of things that I didn't really focus on much in the book. So um, Joe and me were really happy with how it turned out. Joe did a great job of putting everything together, editing it and directing it. Um, and I think it tells a really pretty complete story of what happened here. So it's almost like, I think a lot of most of the time in life you don't really get a chance to uh, have a do-over of a
Hmm.
big project, or to say, well, I can now add chapter two. But it's kind of like, I feel like if you want to get a kind of dry, kind of X's and O's history of Evansville during the war, you can read my book. If you want, the Jimmies and the Joes,
Yeah.
you watch the documentary, and you just get these kind of really sparkly old people talking. We get lots of really cool local experts talking. So it was a huge kind of win-win um, for everybody. And one thing that was really neat, I mean, it was of course really cool to watch it on TV, but before it was even broadcast, it was briefly in the Showplace Theater as a 2 hour film.
Oh, wow.
And we had the poster up in Showplace and all of that. So that was a pretty surreal experience to go into a movie theater, beside people who were buying tickets to go see it, sit there with, popcorn and Coke and watch this film that you'd made.
Oh, that is so
So
cool.
yeah, that was a really, really neat part of the experience. And we had lots of, you know, the folks who were in it were able to see it. With the exception of those who had already passed away by the time it came out. So that was the other thing that was really a kind of bittersweet feeling, was that we were so glad that we were doing this and getting these people's stories recorded,
Hmm.
but we wished we'd done it 20 years before, when A, there would have been way more of them, and B, they would all have been like 70 instead of 90.
Yeah.
But other than that, it was a pretty much unambiguously good experience.
That's incredible. I think I read something last night, actually that's so relevant to this, and it was talking about the idea of like oral histories and the importance of them. And like this is an exact quote, but it was something along the lines of like every generation that dies is like taking a file cabinet of information that's not backed up anywhere and setting
Yeah,
it on fire. And
yeah,
it's like that is true. Like
yeah.
because the stuff that's like the nitty-gritty, that's like people's actual
Mhm.
lives, that is not recorded in the history books. Like you only get that from talking to people. And so I think
Yeah.
that is such an important aspect of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, the pretty much the first day in my intro history class, I have students read a poem by Bertolt Brecht, which is called Questions from a Worker Who Reads. And basically, the gist of the poem, I hope they don't hear this because then they'll just write this down as their answer. But the gist of the poem is, he's looking at the history books and he's seeing the names of all these famous men, and he's asking, where are all the bricklayers and the sailors and the chefs and the nurses, and right, the people that are actually the people that really did do all the things in history
Yeah.
are largely absent. So I really believe really strongly in kind of bottom up history, and the importance of social and cultural history, the importance of women's history. Um, and then then when I wrote the book, it was all kind of it wasn't all, but it was very print centered, as I
Mm-hmm.
said. But I did make a real effort to one of the just a quick little anecdote would be that the the kind of received wisdom on how Evansville got all these orders for World War II was that these like smart businessmen went out and used their connections. And that's true, but it's very much this kind of businessmen are awesome view of the
Mm-hmm.
world. And what I realized was that they did that, but there were also politicians all the way up to and including the White House who were working on this using their connections. And then Evansville labor unions as well used all of their connections. Because remember, it was FDR, so it was a Democratic, labor friendly administration.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually this amazing amalgamation of workers and bosses and politicians pulling together to make this happen in Evansville. And I felt like that's an aspect of the story that hadn't really been told, the kind of workers, organized workers part of the tale. So I felt pretty proud to tell that story.
And that is definitely something I think that does get skipped over. It's like those kinds of um the efforts that like transcend like the social hierarchy. I think those tend to be something
Exactly.
that's skipped over too. It's just like
Yeah.
it's either we're all focusing on the elites or we're
Hmm.
all like consciously focusing on the people who are not elite and like
Hmm.
forgetting that there's actually like an incredible amount of
There
interaction
is.
between those two
Yeah,
groups.
it's a great point.
So
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's a great way of looking at it. And I can completely relate to what you said at the beginning of this when you were saying how like you kind of looked down your nose at local history because I know growing up like I've been interested in archaeology my almost my entire life. And I always knew like, well, I want to do like classical archaeology. Like I don't want to do American archaeology because that's just not as exciting.
Yeah.
And I study classical archaeology here. I study classics. That's what I do. But I actually work for an archaeological firm in Minnesota over the summers.
Right.
And 2 summers ago, when I started working for them, we were excavating like a historical farmstead
Mhm.
that was like being evaluated for like the National Historic Register. And we were just like I mean, I grew up on a farm, so we were just on a farm in somebody's backyard, like digging up their old like pottery and
Yeah,
their glassware and like
that's awesome.
all of these things for a couple of weeks. And it was like I had never felt more connected to like where I grew up. So that was just an incredible experience because it was like, here's something that I'm like, oh, I'm traveling far away from Minnesota to Indiana to study. And I'm like going to Greece in the summers and I'm like doing all these things. And it's like, but there is history right here actually.
Yeah.
And so it gave me like a completely new appreciation for just like the local history that does become part of who you are. So
Yeah, that's a really
yeah.
beautiful story. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think it's really uh, like I mean, and I think the stuff the archaeology program does here is really great as well with the Tin City dig, which is connected to World War II, of course, here as well. The idea that they're U of E students are digging to find out about the lives of U of E students in the
Mm-hmm.
1940s.
Yeah.
There's something kind of beautiful about that. And I love the idea of kind of in your mind, you're thinking about Pompeii and places like that,
Mm-hmm.
and you end up back home on a farm
Yeah.
digging there. Yeah, I think that stuff's really important. I mean, just fairly recently, as you know, there was this huge sewer project downtown that they
Yes, I've been
uncovered.
hearing about that.
And among other things, they discovered this great big mid 19th century cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's literally in your own backyard,
Mm-hmm.
and it's stuff that contains really important information about what life was like here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm increasingly interested in local history. I'm really looking forward to when I go home, connecting with some local historians in my hometown
Mhm.
who, again, I didn't pay any attention to that stuff when I lived there,
Mhm.
but I talk about my hometown all the time now that I'm
No, that you're
I
not there.
not there. I teach a course
Yeah.
in modern Scotland, and I talk about Greenock all the time, as a kind of case study. So much so that one year a student gave me a gift at the end of the semester, and it was a map of Greenock. So it was a really nice gift.
That's fun.
So I've got that in my office. I see it every day.
No, that's good. Yeah, I think the And the idea of like the coming full circle too, I think is interesting too. Like, cause you had like that's kind of that similar experience of like studying these big world pictures and then moving to a different country on a different continent and then ending up like, no, you're still connected. Like you're still connected to where you grew up. Like that's important.
Yeah.
You can't leave that behind.
Yeah.
So.
And the part of the story that my hometown newspaper emphasized was that the teacher from my high school, who is basically the reason that I'm a historian,
Mm-hmm.
he's going to come to my lecture
Mm.
um, in December, and he said, I promise I'll come, but I can't promise that I won't heckle you. I thought that was just great.
That's
But, you
fun.
know, there's things that he said to me when I was 16 that
Mm-hmm.
I know I say in class myself. You know,
Mm.
it's just,
That's a mark
yeah,
of a good teacher, though,
yeah,
being able
yeah.
to take those
Just
things.
the influence that people have on you when you're that age is so tremendous. And just his enthusiasm for the subject was something that was incredibly infectious. So, Mr. Little was his name, and he was
Mm.
a really great teacher. And I'm looking forward very much to seeing him.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Do you have anything that you're working on right now that's like current with the Evansville local history? Because I know like either last year or the year before you did have another book that came
Hmm.
out, but
So I wrote two other books on Evansville history. One was about a cartoonist. I know we're going to talk about that real quick later, but um, Carl K. Connect was a world-class cartoonist who worked in Evansville for the Evansville Courier from 1906 to 1960. So he really his career, and he drew a cartoon almost every day,
oh wow.
um, and like over 18,000 cartoons in his career. Um, Many of his cartoons are in presidential libraries and places like that. And we have about 6,000 of his originals in the archive here at UE. So it's really uh, really interesting. So as a cartoonist myself for the Evansville Courier, it was a really great privilege to write a book about Carl K. Connect.
Mm.
And that came out, I think, in 2017. And then, so that was a pretty busy period of my life. I
I'm
wrote
sure.
two books and
Yeah.
made a film in 3 years. Not quite, I think I had hair when I started and ended up
No.
looking like this. But and then from about 2020 to 23, I was working on a book on post-war Evansville, so the 40s through the 70s. Um, and that's been really, I've probably done, I don't know, 50 different talks about that book. And that's been really great because people do remember that, and your audience is full of people who were here in that period, and you show pictures
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, "Oh yeah, you know, I was there." So that's been really, really neat um, to be doing more contemporary history. And so the part of that that I think I will continue with is the part of that book that focused on the civil rights movement in Evansville. So really, Evansville's just again a really fascinating little microcosm of what was happening across the country. We had people doing sit-ins, we had people doing boycotts, we had people going through the pain of being the first black kid in a white school and all of that. And when you were saying yesterday, few minutes ago, Grace, about the different perspectives and how you have to look at both perspectives, there's a really interesting um, pair of photographs that were in an Evansville newspaper. One of our schools has been integrated in the mid 50s, and there's a photo of a little white kid holding hands with a bunch of black kids as they're kind of skipping across the playground.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just looked at that picture, you could say, "Look at us!
There we go.
This
Yeah.
is integration in Evansville." But the photographer also took a picture of the other side of the street, which was a bunch of white parents demonstrating against black kids
Oh
in the
wow.
school. And they've got signs like stay in your own schools and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. And if you just looked at that picture, you would say, oh, Evansville was terrible. They were so anti-integration. And the reality is the two photos were side by side in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like,
That's a powerful message.
it is, I think, because you know I've used various metaphors to try to communicate that to students, and it's like here it literally is. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you could say, as so often with history, it's not one thing or the other. It's a complex mix of both.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's obviously a very worthy thing to research going forward, like the civil rights stuff that is it's still impactful for sure.
And to um, when I first put together a PowerPoint presentation about that story, it ended up the very last slide was a kind of a Black Lives Matter demonstration from Evansville
Mm-hmm.
that I was at with my daughter in 2020. I was kind of pessimistic ending to the story. You know, we've got ways to go, which we do for sure. But now the last slide of my presentation is the mayor of Evansville, who's a black woman,
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie Terry. And it's a pretty iconic image of her looking at a row of photos of all the previous mayors of Evansville, and they're all white men,
Mm-hmm.
at least one of whom was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So it's a really powerful symbolic image of
It is, yeah.
change, right? So, you know, now you can kind of say, well, we're here and we
Mm-hmm.
still have ways to go, but
But
we're here.
progress is being
Yeah,
made.
progress
Yeah,
has been made.
absolutely. Absolutely. I definitely want to ask you and talk about the cartoons, but before we do that, I did want to say, I think sometimes people in college have this fear of like, I'm locking myself in forever. Like, this is what I'm majoring in, or I'm doing my honors thesis, and like, oh no, like, this is what grad schools are going to look at, and I'm going to be held to this, like, even as an undergrad, let alone in like graduate school. And so, like, I think your story, like, kind of tells the lie of that to say that you're free to change your research interests. So I just wanted to like bring that up and give you the chance if you had anything that you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point. And you know, it maybe varies a little bit from discipline to discipline. And I realize I've been very lucky. I mean, I'm very lucky, period, just to have the job that I have. I'm extremely thankful that I'm a history professor. It's a really amazing job. And to spend your life with bright young people is an incredible privilege, and then you get to force them to read books. So it's really fantastic. But yeah, I think the stats show that most people are going to change their job many times over the course of their adult life. And academics are going to adjust and tweak their research interests as well. So, you know, I think we've had the privilege of bringing in lots of really distinguished historians as part of one or other of our lecture series here
Mm-hmm.
at UE. And when you look at their body of work, it's
Mm.
almost always you can see a connection between what's there at the end and what's there at the beginning, but some of them have gone on a very long and winding road to get from A to B. So, yeah, I would encourage you to, you know, if you're thinking about the life, a scholarly life or life as an academic, if you have interests, you know, you might have to put them aside at various points in your life, but don't forget about them. You can always come back to them. And I would definitely also say too that I think there's an extra challenge, of course, for women, as there almost always is in the way our society is set up. That women to to not be discouraged by the fact that depending on the choices in your life, it may be that you are going to have a family, and that family is going to put there's going to be pressures there and commitments there, but you can do that and do the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that for a while and then go back to the other thing, or maybe that is the thing that you want to do is you want to be a mother, a parent. But don't be discouraged at this stage when you're 22, thinking, "Oh, there's no point starting because I also want to have a family and I'm gonna get sidetracked and people aren't gonna hire me." You know, over the years, I've met so many fantastic, incredibly talented and productive female academics. It is very doable. Um, and I absolutely acknowledge that it's harder for women because of the patriarchal way our society is set up, including academia. But don't let that discourage you.
No, I think that's a valuable way to look at it. It's like, and I mean, on any situation to say like there are challenges,
Hmm.
but you don't have to like, they don't have to force you to not even start.
Right.
Like start, begin, like
Hmm.
do what you think you need to do,
Hmm.
and then go from there.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think those are both really valuable pieces of advice. That idea that you can change and like you can put interests aside and come back to them
Right.
is too. I think is really
Yeah.
good. So, yeah. So then before we end, I want to talk about the cartoons because
Okay.
this is so This is so different. I had no idea that you did cartoons until you had first like written back to me, and I was like, this is fantastic. So how did this start? Like, as you said, you write like though you do them for like the Evansville papers. Like,
Yeah.
how did you start publishing? Like, what was that whole journey like?
So I was always a doodler, so all my lecture notes from high school and college, which I had all the history lecture notes I still have, they're all covered in doodles.
Mm.
Drawings of teachers and stuff like that.
I'm sure they love
Um,
that.
and I'm absolutely not a gifted artist at all, but I was always doodling, and I still am. Um, and so I drew cartoons for the college newspaper and stuff like that. And then I got away from it a little bit, and then the early 2000s, it was really driven by the Iraq War.
Mm.
Started in 2003. I started drawing cartoons about that, and I decided that I was going to commit to drawing a cartoon every day, a political cartoon. So I started a blog, and I committed to drawing something every day. And that's what I would say is whatever your kind of creative outlet is, or your work outlet, the only way you're ever gonna get anywhere is by repetition and
Mm.
practice. Um, and I'm not sure I'm not sure how much better I've got, to be honest. Some people would say my cartoons are still terrible, but just you know just almost the muscle memory of constant repetition. And then so in about 2007, it was almost by coincidence, somebody at the Courier asked me if I would supply a cartoon to illustrate a particular story. And that encouraged me, so I kept submitting cartoons to the opinion page editor, and eventually he started using them every now and again. And then for a period, in the maybe 2010 to 15, around about there, they were using my cartoons every day. So I was selling them like 7 or 8 cartoons a week.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, that was really awesome. And then like many other newspapers, the Courier's been bought, and it's shrunk.
Mm-hmm.
And it uses far fewer um, uh, local writers or artists or whatever. So
Right.
they only use one cartoon a week. They only publish one cartoon a week now, which is on Sundays. But they still use me for that. So that's pretty cool. So I would say just persistence, I suppose. You've got to be happy with, or willing to to face rejection, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're never going to get anything that you don't ask for. And oftentimes the answer is going to be no, but you got to just keep coming. Um, and then I just find that so um, the what I think is interesting is that it's almost like two opposite sides of my life. Um, as a historian, I'm trying to be objective at all times.
Mm.
As I was saying earlier, it's kind of all about nuance and looking at both sides and communicating to students that you have to look at all sides of an issue. You have to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Yeah, like we were saying at the very beginning, you have to listen to people. So I think that's a really important part of my life and my profession. But as a cartoonist, you're absolutely not both sides in it at all. I mean, editors aren't going to buy a cartoon that is like mealy mouthed, or on the one hand
Mm.
this, on the other hand that. And definitely in this day and age, people aren't going to click and share a cartoon that doesn't take a position on something. So, I think in my cartoons I'm much more stridently one-sided in terms of politics or social issues or
Mm.
cultural issues or whatever. Um, and these are all controversial things that people argue about and fight about, and say mean things on social media about. And you gotta kind of just stick your head out there and do it, and be prepared to be called all manner of things. And I'm fine with that. Like I believe that if you're gonna dish it out, you have to be willing to take it.
Yeah, really though, you do. especially if you know that like that I didn't know that or didn't think about that with like the idea that like no, they want things that are controversial, like they want things that are picking a side because I think
Mhm.
there could be some educational value in having some cartoons that are trying to look at things from both sides, but that isn't going to get you views. So that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So it's funny because obviously there's issues, abortion or gun control, or First Amendment rights or Israel and Palestine, whatever, right? They're all immensely complex, um, philosophical um, issues, sometimes complex historical issues, cultural, religious issues, um, where there's probably a ton of gray areas there. Um, but you've got 15 minutes with your iPad to draw a
Right.
cartoon, so you're not typically going for nuance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely. And so has that been kind of consistent? It sounds like most of the cartoons that you've done, like through your life, they have been like the more like the political, because that's it's getting
Yeah,
bullish, like that orientation.
when I was first starting off, I wanted really to be a gag cartoonist, like to draw funny cartoons that would make people laugh. And I think I'm a pretty funny person, and um I think I've got a good sense of humor and all of that, but I find it really hard to create gag cartoons. It's a pretty difficult thing to do. Um, and then I thought, well, that only leaves political cartoons, and I wasn't really sure
Only there's only two options.
how to do that. So, again, it was just practice. I would say the first ones I did were extremely clunky,
Mm,
but over time you get kind of fluent at it. Um, and I think being a historian and someone who's really interested in politics really helps because
I'm
you're
sure, yeah.
you're constantly reading stuff, so you're always aware of, what's the latest thing that Trump has said or the latest gaffe that Biden has come out with or whatever,
Mm,
right? You were watching it anyway.
right.
So, and I'm always just sitting there with my iPad drawing anyway. So,
There you go.
I would also say in terms of like, to go back to my thing about local history, that
Mm,
when I was in the paper every day, you weren't publishing controversial political cartoons every day. A lot of the cartoons were kind of, they weren't exactly gag cartoons, but they were just poking fun oftentimes at local issues. And they were also celebrating local achievements, So one of the things I'm really proud about is that my my three kids have all gone through or are going through Signature School. It's a public charter school, incredibly high quality school in Evansville. And when you walk into the foyer of Signature School, they've got a bunch of my
oh,
cartoons
that's really
framed on the
cool.
wall. And they're all cartoons that I drew celebrating Signature School, many of which I drew before my kids were even there. So that's just an example that you kind of have to. And Carl K. Connect did a brilliant job of this. He was a huge booster for the community.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think your job is sometimes to be a booster for the community, sometimes to criticize
Mm,
the flaws of the community. Evansville's got a terrible habit of really dragging its feet on change, and people are always sitting around talking about all the downsides of whatever it is you're proposing.
right.
So that's a pretty easy thing to mock as a
Yeah.
cartoonist. So that's kind of part of it as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think just like that idea of like holding the culture that you live in accountable,
Hmm.
like both to its good aspects and its bad aspects, I think is like art has a unique quality and a unique ability to do that. So I
Exactly.
think that's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a particular cartoon that you're like particularly proud of?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked because yes, in 2015, when ISIS terrorists attacked the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris and slaughtered a bunch of cartoonists because they were cartoonists. Um, I heard that news and I immediately drew a cartoon that it was basically a an image of a kind of jihadist with a machine gun and blood on the floor, and he was captioned "powerful." And then the second half of the cartoon was a cartoonist's hand drawing a cartoon and actually drawing a bubble saying "Je suis Charlie," which was kind of the slogan that people adopted after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And that the caption on that was more powerful. So it said powerful, more powerful. And I threw this thing together like super fast. I published it, and it got picked up just purely through chance. It got picked up by Vox almost immediately, and then from then on, it was just this cascade. It went enormously viral. All over the world, newspapers all over the world, the AP, NPR, CNN, Washington Post. This cartoon, oftentimes they would collect like 5 or 10 cartoons from around the world that were responding to the attack. And my cartoon was one of them all the time. The U.S. State Department's website had it on its landing page for 3 days in a row.
Oh, wow.
So, and I was interviewed on MSNBC. It was really crazy. I mean, it was like nothing else in my cartooning life. And as soon as this it started happening, I was like, oh my goodness, is this even a good cartoon? And I'm looking back.
It's too late to decide now.
I'm like, man, I wish I had spent 15 minutes on it instead of 10 minutes on it. So that's really cool. So that's the answer to your question. But what is also, I think, absolutely hilarious is that when I drew the terrorist, he had a kind of hood on with just his eyes showing. And when you're using an electronic medium to draw, you can just a little paint bucket thing to fill color.
Right.
And I meant to give him some color for the little bit of his face that was poking through, but in the rush, it didn't happen, so it just ended up plain white. About 2 years later, some academic wrote an article about the cartoons that responded to the Charlie Hebdo shooting, and one of it was like one of three, I think, was mine. And this academic has this, and it's in an academic journal. There's this whole piece about the symbolism of my drawing. It talks about like the role that triangles play in this drawing, like the lines and all of this stuff, none of which was in my head.
Oh my goodness.
There's even a section about, how profoundly smart I was to leave the face just plain white, that I wasn't making any racial comment, and it was just like, actually, it's because I forgot to click the little paint bucket icon. So it was,
wow.
and not to mock this particular academic, I'm sure it's once you publish something, it's legitimate for someone else to interpret it, but it was a kind of reminder to me too as a historian when you look at some work of art or something and you're preaching some deep symbolism of, the dark color on one side as opposed to the other.
Yeah.
Maybe the painter just ran out of blue paint, who knows. So I thought that was a pretty funny kind of postscript to the story.
That is funny. I think it reminds me of like the kind of like, I guess, like the joke or like the meme that goes around with like English, where it's like English teachers like talking about like, oh, like the blue curtains and it's a symbol that the character is sad and she's hiding in the dark, and it's like what the author meant was actually just the curtains were blue. Like,
exactly.
And it's like that's so true. Like you don't really know. You don't really know what people mean all the time, but that's a really spectacular example of that. There's a whole article on it somewhere.
It really is.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, if it would help to have that cartoon I can send it to you.
That would be fantastic if you wouldn't mind having it in the article, because then people can see it. That's be much better than me describing it.
Right,
So
exactly. There's nothing more boring than a cartoonist describing their own cartoon. There's just a little bit over here. But it's been. I mean, I think when you get really frustrated about the world and the way the world is, I at least have this outlet where I can sit down and draw something and feel like I'm getting it off my chest, and um, communicating to the people that think the same way I do. It's an act of solidarity as far as I'm concerned. That you know that you're not alone. There's this other there's this other guy in Evansville that thinks like you.
Yeah.
I think it's a pretty important thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think you've shared a lot of the good things that are good, like for people who are interested in cartooning, people who are interested in and getting their stuff out there. Just like you said, like if you got to be willing to stick your neck out there. You got to be willing to like face rejection, to like take a stance, to do all these things. And so I think those will be really helpful takeaways for people too, who are just interested in like art, who are interested in getting their work out there.
Yeah,
So.
and I think definitely being open to critics, listening to suggestions. I think some early critics I was not very open to suggestions because I interpreted them as kind of attacks. Um, Sometimes they were attacks, but sometimes they were just like, actually, I can't draw hands, you know.
Oh no.
And that's the other thing I'd say for anyone that's thinking in terms of like creativity, like visual communication. Um, the most important thing for a political cartoonist is not being able to draw perfectly or have perfect command of 3 point um, perspective or whatever. It's having an opinion, and then having a vision of how you would put that in a drawing. Because there's some really, of course, there's amazing cartoonists who are also brilliant artists, and they can draw cartoons that I could only dream about drawing. I'm very much a kind of two-dimensional, flat plane, big nose, big feet, kind of clumsy hands characters. But I know my limitations and I can draw cartoons that say serious things with that limit.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say don't, just because you haven't mastered all the chords, or just because you're not a perfect painter yet, or just because your singing voice is still developing, don't let that stop you. Just keep going, keep doing it, get it out there. If you're a musician, record your music. Put it out on TikTok and Instagram and all of that stuff. Um, and maybe nothing will ever happen, and that's fine too. If you enjoy doing it.
If you That's the important thing, if like you said, like you talk about being like it's like an outlet, it's an act of like solidarity, it's like a community building thing. Like if you enjoy it, that's the important thing. But yeah, I really like that idea. Like don't let the fact that you're like still developing stop you from doing what you're doing. So yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts that you want to add? Anything else before we wrap up?
I think I did think about it, but I think your questions were really great. You did a great job. I mean, I would just really underline uh, how privileged I feel to have this job. Um, Really, from the first day that I got up in a classroom at Harlexton, um, my first job at Harlexton was teaching Renaissance history, and I had studied precisely nothing about
Nothing
Renaissance.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was absolutely, one chapter ahead of the students. Um, but I mean, I literally went in there and wrote the word Renaissance on a whiteboard and said, "What does that word mean?" Um, and 50 minutes later, we'd covered both sides of the whiteboard, and I think everybody had learned stuff. And that was pretty much where I decided this is how I'm going to teach. So, I go in every day to class, and they've hopefully prepared answers to my questions, but, I ask a question, I write on the board, and that's how it goes. And um, I really believe very strongly in a kind of wisdom of crowds sort of idea that, maybe there's individually we don't have all the answers to this question, but between the 20 of us in this class, we can come up with a pretty good set of answers to these questions. So, I quite often post on Facebook just photos of my blackboard or my whiteboard, because I just think it's great that a bunch of 18-year-olds come up with, 22 answers to the question of, why did the Rwandan genocide happen?
Right.
So I just love being around students. I love being around young folks. Um, I think many old professors like me complain about young people and all the stuff that you can't do, and you don't read enough, and you can't write, and all of that stuff. And up to a point, that's
A part of
true.
it's justifiable.
Part of it's
But
justifiable. But number one, professors have always been complaining about their students. You look back to medieval times, and
mhm.
professors are whining about their students. I always tell students that the only Calvin, the Protestant reformer, was a professor at the University of Paris, and the only image that was created of him during his lifetime was a student's doodle in his notebook
Oh,
of
wow.
Calvin's head. And like, so this is Calvin, one of the biggest brains in human history, is teaching you, and you're just sitting there drawing a picture of his head. And so I love that. I think it's very kind of humbling,
Wow.
professor,
Yeah.
that students have always been terrible, right? But they've always been awesome. And I think students today are, they are every bit as great as 18 to 22-year-olds have ever been. They don't read books as much, they don't write as eloquently, but they can do 20 other things that their predecessors couldn't do. And if you poke them hard enough and teach them well enough, they can do anything. How about we finish there?
That sounds like a good place to finish. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to do this.
Yeah, it's been really, really great. You did a
Yes,
wonderful
thank you.